This is the lecture for Travis Timmerman's A Dilemma for Epicureanism. So the first topic, 243, he talks about biconditionals. He says PL and PD are not formulated as biconditionals. And this is PL and PD. PL, any person P has a pro tanto self-regarding reason to prefer and ensure, if possible, continued life at time T. If P's total well-being would be higher at P if P doesn't die at T than if she does die at T, and so on. So we have, this is basically an if-then statement. If P's total well-being would be higher if P does not die at T than if she does not die at T. So if this, then this. And similarly for PD. If P's total well-being would be higher if P dies at T than if she doesn't die at T. If that, then that. So this is known as a conditional statement. A conditional is if, then. If this thing, then this other thing. And of course, as you see, like in English, you can do it the other way around. This other thing, if this thing. But sometimes it's easier to think of if, then. And so you take this sentence, the if comes next, comes at the end. If this, then this. So that is a conditional statement. A biconditional statement is sort of if, sorry, it's, I set up the lecture so that these two come after each other, but it turns out a biconditional statement is this, if and only if. So in a moment we'll see this, but a biconditional statement is just if and only if this, then that. So I say if P's total well-being would be higher if P doesn't die at T than if she does die at T, and only if P's total well-being would be higher at P if she doesn't, then this. So let's look at much simpler examples. If it rains, then the ground will get wet. That is a conditional. If it rains, then the ground will get wet. And again, in English, we can flip it around. The ground will get wet if it rains. So that's a conditional statement. A biconditional statement would be if and only if it rains, then the ground will get wet. So the first statement, the conditional statement, if it rains, then the ground will be wet. That's pretty good. That makes sense. That's a sort of correct conditional statement. The biconditional in that instance is incorrect. If and only if it rains, the ground will get wet. No, there's other ways to make the ground wet. The ground can get wet if we dump some water on it out of a bucket. So the biconditional in that case is false. But there are also, true biconditional statements. So I have if, well, I should have thought of an example before I started saying that, but there are plenty of true biconditionals. And of course, the easiest way to make a true biconditional is just to put the same thing on both sides. So I have a head if and only if I have a head, or if and only if I have a head, then I have a head. So that's very simple. And then, as I sort of previewed a moment ago, on 245, he uses at the top IFF, this phrase IFF. This just means if and only if. And so that gets you a biconditional. So Sage can avoid such a fate if and only if she immediately takes the cyanide capsule she has hidden on her. So if she immediately takes the cyanide capsule she has hidden on her, and only if she takes that cyanide capsule she has hidden on her, she can avoid such a fate. So the only way for her to avoid a fate is if she takes the capsule, and taking the capsule will, in fact, help her avoid the fate. So that's if and only if is just a quick way. Sorry, IFF is just a quick way of writing if and only if is a biconditional. On 246, he uses this, he says in this parenthetical, for example, bad for equals little df, a painful state. So this, I don't know, symbol, phrase, whatever, equals then the little df. That means you're sort of getting a definition. So he's saying bad for is defined as a painful state. So equals df means the thing on the left is being defined as the thing on the right. So df stands for definition. And yeah, so when you see equals df, and the only time you're going to see this is in this paper right now, but maybe in future philosophy readings, when you see that, they are defining the thing on the left as the thing on the right. On 254, there is some discussion of semantic externalism, reference magnetism, carving nature at its joints. So these three things, they're not super important for understanding the article, but they're interesting topics in the philosophy of language, which is a topic we haven't talked a lot about this semester. So I thought I'd discuss this a bit. So at least you know what's going on, and maybe you can learn some stuff about the philosophy of language. So semantic externalism is easy to understand by contrasting it with a sort of competing theory, semantic internalism. And semantic externalism and semantic internalism are both theories about how words get their meaning. So why does the word apple refer to apples and not to hands? Why does the word hair refer to hair and not to noses? So how do we determine the meaning of terms? What makes it the case that apple means apple as opposed to hand or something? So semantic internalism says that meaning is sort of a property entirely inside our heads. So you can imagine the reason apple means apple is because of certain thoughts that we have. So because I believe that the word apple is linked to, apples as opposed to hands, that is why the word apple means apple. And so according to semantic internalism, word meanings exist sort of entirely as thoughts within human beings. If everybody changed their thoughts, that would immediately change the meaning of every word, or whatever. If everybody changed like every thought about every word, that would change the meaning of every word. People could we can change the word meanings just with our thoughts. Semantic externalism says, no, the meaning of words is not just entirely in our heads. There's obviously an internal component. So of course, word meanings have something to do with our thoughts. It's not like word meanings are just out there before we exist. Although we did see actually a very radical semantic externalism according to which the meaning of languages is sort of determined before humans exist. We saw this in our previous unit on the existence of God. The Nyaya understanding of God is such that God sort of created language, so that sort of like words meant things before we came along. So that's super semantic externalism. There, the meaning of words has nothing to do with us. That's not the typical semantic externalism in modern philosophy. In modern philosophy, word meanings to some degree depend on us, but they also depend on sort of some things outside of ourselves. So what are these? Well, it depends what kind of semantic externalist you are. There's lots of different kind of semantic externalisms, but the one we're going to look at has to do with reference magnetism and carving nature at its joints. So this gets kind of complicated, but the simple idea is pretty easy to understand. So the idea of carving nature at its joints is the idea that, look, nature is sort of like, it has joints, so to speak. And what joints are sort of like natural divisions. So nature is already sort of like split up into stuff. There are apples, there are trees, there are rivers, there are mountains, there are planets, there are stars, and so on. Nature is not just one undifferentiated mass. It's not just like arbitrary how you divide nature. It makes more sense to divide nature up into apples and trees and rivers and mountains and stuff, because these are separate sorts of things that exist in nature. They don't depend on us. It's not like whether or not the apple exists depends on us. There are apples. There are sort of separate things in nature. And so it makes sense to have a word for apple, a word for mountain, a word for tree or whatever, because these are separate things in nature. When you have words like this, then your words sort of carve nature at its joints. Your word apple picks out something separate in nature. Your word tree picks out something separate. in nature. Imagine I had a word called like tree apple or something, and it describes trees and apples. So every time I see a tree, I call it a tree apple. Every time I see an apple, I call it a tree apple. I could have a word like that, but that's a really weird word because it just refers to two relatively unrelated things. It seems cleaner to have one word for one sort of thing and another word for another sort of thing. That division more closely carves nature at its joints. So semantic externalism says, uh, broadly speaking, when you're trying to figure out what terms mean, uh, you sort of use this reference magnetism idea and you say, look, the meaning of a term is determined at least in part by not just how it's used, but also how closely it carves nature at its joints. So if I ask, what does the word apple mean? Of course, people use the word apple, they'll point at apples and they say that's an apple or whatever. And when they're pointing, it's not like pointing magically picks out just the apple. You're pointing in the direction of apple, but there's other stuff there too. There's the air around the apple. There's the tree it's attached to, maybe. There's the ground under the apple. There's the sky behind the apple. How do we know what we're referring to when we say apple? The internalist would say we look inside their heads. The externalist, who's doing this sort of reference magnetism, carving nature at its joints thing, would say, well, look, in addition to looking inside people's heads, we would look at sort of like what's the most natural understanding of what's going on, like what's being picked out when somebody points at the apple. Well, the apple plus the sky around it or the air around it or whatever, that doesn't really carve nature at its joints if we assume the word apple refers to the fruit and also the air in like 4 centimeters around the fruit. That's not like a natural kind of way of carving nature. The natural way of carving nature is that they're just talking about the apple itself, the fruit itself. So that's the idea. If we're sort of trying to figure out the meaning of words and it's not entirely determined by other stuff, then we might look at, well, in the sort of contest between apple refers to just the fruit or apple refers to the fruit plus like some of the air around it. Well, the first carves nature at its joints more cleanly. So that's what apple means. So, there's a lot to say about this, and you can look into this more if you'd like to, but that's an introduction to these kinds of ideas.